people are going to be so mad they missed this. Luckily, Kiley's filming, so they'll be able to watch it online at some point, but they'll be upset that they weren't here in person. I want to welcome everybody to, this is the Historic Springfield Society, and those of you who are not familiar with this organization, I'll tell you all about it in a minute. This is our first Historic Preservation Month event. Never done this before. Decided this was the year to start doing events associated with preservation because that's one of the things we're about. That's this organization. So May 2026 is kind of a landmark for us. We're going to do 3 events. I'll talk about all 3 of them in a minute, but just to let everybody know that the plan is to continue this every year, in addition to all the other things that we do during the year. Very quickly, a little introduction to Historic Springfield Society. We are the oldest continuously operated organization in Springfield. We were founded in May of 1904 as the Springfield Improvement Association. We've had a few name changes over the years. Our group, from the very beginning, met in houses and churches. It was somewhat of a social group, but it also was very involved in political activities. They had parties in the park. They organized these massive parties. The newspapers are full of all these great details about who's doing which booth and what the refreshments are, and the symphony orchestra is there, and everybody's in what was then Springfield Park, now Puka Park. But they also raised money for local schools. We had a lot of different schools in the neighborhood way back in the day, and both elementary and what we now call middle schools and even a high school. And Springfield Improvement Association, the women of that group decided they needed to help these schools out because they weren't getting any more funding then than they do now. And then they also lobbied for neighborhood improvements. One of the stories that everybody talks about is one of their first jobs was to figure out a way to get the city to get the livestock off the streets. You know, cows and sheep running around in the streets of Springfield back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the lobbying for neighborhood improvements, but it included a lot more than that. It included, our organization was instrumental in getting the architecture set up down along Hogan's Creek. All the balustrades and the bridges and stuff like that was because the Springfield Improvement Association figured out a way to get money from the city to hire Henry Clutho and his partner Imison to do all the engineering and all that design work to get that stuff done. Difficult at the time. This was in the 1920s. By that time, the women who were members of this group had the vote. But before that, their power was the power that they had with their very powerful husbands. They could talk to them, send them down to the city council meeting and get stuff done, which they did. You know, a lot of things happening for Springfield. And Springfield developed because of that. By the early 1930s, after meeting in churches and people's homes and things like that, they decided they needed a headquarters. So they arranged with the local Springfield Presbyterian Church, which is down in the next corner. The Springfield Church had built a new building, the one that's down there right now, and this building sat next to the site of the building that was built in the early 1920s. And they decided they didn't need that building anymore. They wanted to build a different Sunday school building, which is what they were using this for. This building was built in 1906, still. We're working on that. We may not be right on that. We're learning so much more about some of the information from some of the new information sources. But as far as we know right now, it was built about 1906. And the Springfield Improvement Association and Women's Club at the time was able to procure the building as long as they moved it to a different location. So the city provided them with this piece of property. They cut the building in half. There's a seam right in the floor back there. I know lots of you have seen it, but right back in the floor. That's where they split the building in half, moved it up here in 2 pieces, put it back together again, and we're here. Been here since 1933. So that's the general history just going up through that time, and I'll probably do a presentation at some point about that because, again, these new information sources that Kiley and I have run across are really, they tell a really interesting story, and I think people will be interested to hear it. But in the meantime, going back to these presentations we're doing, these events we're doing, the next one will be on May 24th, and it's going to be called House Detectives Trace the History of Your Springfield Home, and it'll be a presentation, but it'll also be a workshop. So people are interested in learning the history of their historic house can come bring your laptop. You don't have to if you don't want to, but you can bring your laptop and we'll get you set up on different sites. Kylie and I are going to kind of tag team with that about the information sources that are available to everybody to do this. And you can do it yourself, which is great. We love doing it for people, but we also want other people to know, to learn how to actually do research on their own so that you know what it is, where you live, the people who live there. On May 30th, we are going to have our now annual birthday party, 122nd birthday party. It's going to be the Historic Springfield Edwardian Garden Party, and that starts at 6 o'clock. Our presentation, the House Detectives one, is 2:30 in the afternoon. You'll see it, it's on the calendars. You'll see that. And that brings us to tonight's presentation, which Kylie is going to give. Now, I told Kylie I was going to do a little introduction to him. He said, "Why? You know who I am." I said, "No, no," and most other people do. But a little bit of history for Kylie because he has a great deal of knowledge about this particular subject and also about this particular neighborhood. He's been here since 2013. He and his family moved here in 2013. And in 2019, he graduated from the Savannah College of Art and Design with a preservation design degree. Now, 2019 was that year right before 2020, and things got a little messy after that. Luckily, Kylie decided to stay here and continue to do work. He's been working in the library system for Duval County. For how many years have you been in the library? 5 years, okay. He's been an active member of this organization and its different names through the years since his very first board meeting in 2014, which, if any of you know kind of how this works, if you come to a board meeting, you become a board member immediately. You don't have to even ask, they just make you a board member. Kylie has been a friend of mine and a colleague of mine for that many years at least, and I'm proud to call him a friend, and I want to introduce him to this presentation. Porches.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Jeff. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all so much for coming. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I enjoy helping people research their historic house history, how to find that. My true passion is the architecture and architectural styles. So I'm really thankful that you all are giving me the opportunity to present this evening. I also want to thank Terra Wise for sponsoring our Preservation Month activities here at HSS for the entire month. So a big thank you to them as well. So our presentation this evening is Porches, Turrets, and Time Travel Inside Springfield's Architectural History. Some housekeeping beforehand. The images of examples that you'll see, the majority through this presentation are all Springfield. I dug through my phone camera from all of my years of taking pictures of houses. So unless I point something out to you, which I will tell you what is not in the neighborhood, the majority of the imagery that you see in this presentation are all architectural features and houses that you're going to find wandering the streets in our community. So I want to get that out of the way. Susan, I think you're the only person in this room who was at the presentation I did 5 years ago, which was the first one. And so this one is a little bit different. This one is going to be much deeper into the history of everything. So, buckle in. Yes. Okay, so I guess the first place I want to start before we get into the frame vernacular style is talking about Springfield's evolution. I won't get too deep into the weeds here, but it's important for understanding the entire picture of our architectural history in the neighborhood. So prior to 1901, Springfield did have development. It was an affluent suburb. There were grand homes in the neighborhood, very large homes, but not very many. It was still very sparse at that point. And if you lived in Springfield at that time, north of the Hogan's Creek area, it was considered pretty far out in the country. It was a suburb. The majority of development was along Laura, Main, Market, and Hubbard. Those were the streets, and below 4th Street really is where there were clusters of large homes from that era. The Great Fire of 1901 was the catalyst that changed all of that. After the Great Fire, you can imagine the trauma that people experienced living downtown, losing everything. They didn't want to rebuild downtown. So afterwards, a lot of people looked at Springfield and were like, oh, that's a really nice neighborhood. It's a suburb, it's a little bit outside of the city limits. You know what, I think I'm going to rebuild there. So we had an influx of people that moved into Springfield after the fire, and then after that, we'll get to this later, but Springfield was also seen as a massive opportunity for growth. So people from outside the city after that saw Jacksonville as a blank slate. They came here, and we had this massive influx of all industries, but especially the building industry. Because if you think you have to rebuild an entire downtown of a city, that's a lot of people coming into one place, and a lot of them ended up in Springfield. So we're also going to talk about that influence of how a lot of our houses in the neighborhood, though to our modern eye look very unique, a lot of them are cookie cutter houses of that time period. So we'll get into that as well. So frame vernacular is the most common style of architecture that you'll find in historic Springfield. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood as saying common and hearing it as a derogatory term. When I say common, I mean that it is just very prevalent. So these houses were your working class houses, and these were your houses that were just essential dwellings. They weren't trying to be anything more than what they are, which is a shelter. Some of them will have stylistic elements that are influenced from other high-style buildings, but not anything that will be enough to put it over the edge and make it a specific high-style building. So these are your frame dwellings. Typically, they can be 1 or 2 story, not a lot of ornamentation going on, and a good vernacular element that I always use as an example in historic Springfield is the amount of double porches that we have in the neighborhood, which served a function that was essential. You socialized on your front porch, and then on your second story porch, it's where you would use it as a sleeping porch and escape those hot summers. So it served a very functional purpose. And then throughout this presentation, I have a book that I really love. And, I also have some references at the end on sheets that I can pass out if anyone's interested with book recommendations of some of the books that I've used this evening if you're interested in further reading. So this artist is fabulous, and he chronicled every architectural style in American history up to 1960 from the beginning. And he did illustrations of what home interiors were like of specific time periods. And so this is what your common Edwardian era parlor in a Springfield house would have looked like. You would have had wallpaper. You can see that the furniture is really around the perimeter of the room. We don't have those clustered conversation areas that we have present day. And then we have family portraits, oil paintings hanging from the picture rail molding, and then it's just a very cozy, homey space. It's where the family would have gathered. It's where you would have received visitors into your home. And you would have showcased your finest pieces in this room. And then I also like to point out they're called portières. It's not something you really see anymore, but these were curtains that were room dividers. You could use them in like large door openings where you didn't have pocket doors. They served the function of you could close them if you didn't have doors and make it a separate space. And it also helped trap air in the room as well. All right, so now the Queen Anne style. Now, those of you that know me know that this is my very favorite style of architecture, and its origins are also very interesting. So you can pinpoint it to 2 different beginnings. So this is has the moniker of being the first official Queen Anne house that was erected in the United States. It's in Newport, Rhode Island. It was erected by it was designed by Henry Hobson Richardson. It's the Watts Sherman House. And it was inspired by medieval architecture from the Elizabethan era in England. So we have lots of Tudor half timbering on the second story. It's very reminiscent of Tudor buildings that you would find in England. And very stone structure on the first story, very clearly delineated different floors, lots of asymmetry, projecting wings and bays, tall brick chimneys. Really, there's a lot going on here. So this is the first official Queen Anne house that was built in America. And it was published in several publications. However, this one is not what propelled the style to popularity in the country. That was done by this gentleman here, a man by the name of Richard Norman Shaw. He was an English architect, and he designed a lot of buildings that took inspiration from also the same time period styles, Elizabethan era country houses, So again, very Tudor-like structures, but you can see an example here of a quite massive structure that he designed in 1868 in Sussex, England. It's the beginnings of our Queen Anne style. So it's very asymmetrical. We have a tower there. We have lots of asymmetry, projecting bays, chimneys. Now, of course, this is a much more grand scale than anything you're going to see in the States, but it's the beginning of that. So Shaw was commissioned to design one of the buildings that was featured at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876. This was an exhibition that was obviously held in Philadelphia to commemorate the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was very well attended. I think there were, let me look at my notes here to get the figure right. There were 200 buildings and 10 million visitors over the course of 6 months. So this was a highly attended event. I apologize for the graininess of this image. Believe it or not, it was very hard to find an image of this building. So this was the English compound here that Shaw designed. And once again, you can see that he's taking inspiration from the Tudor era of architecture. So the Queen Anne style is a bit of a misnomer because the name Queen Anne really has no relation whatsoever to the style that was prevalent during the reign of Queen Anne. In fact, Queen Anne really did not have any groundbreaking architecture that came from her reign at all. So he named it that simply because he liked the politics and the grandeur that he associated with her ruling. So he named the style Queen Anne to commemorate her. A common theme that you're going to see this evening with all of these names of elements and architecture is that it's really not so much related to the style, but it's more a marketing tool. So that's going to pop up several times where the name is going to have little or nothing to do with the actual architecture. It's very interesting. And then I just include this image. I love this here. This is an actual image of a photo souvenir book that you could acquire at the Centennial Exposition. So very cool. You can put your photos in there and postcards to take them home with you. So that's very cool. So one of my favorite books is A Field Guide to American Houses. If you're interested in different architectural styles, I highly recommend it. It is the best. My copy is very dog-eared and tattered. It was written by Virginia and Lee McAllister. And for the Queen Anne style, they actually have broken it down into 4 subtypes. It's so diverse and distinct that it has 4 different categories. So they are the spindled Queen Anne, free classic, patterned masonry, and half timbered. So you're not going to see the patterned masonry or half timbered in Springfield at all. We don't have any examples of those. You're going to find those mostly in your large cities such as New York, Boston. There's actually some patterned masonry in Savannah. So those are the cities where you're really going to see, it's mostly the row houses. You see them a lot on row houses. Think your brick row houses in places like Boston. That's where you're going to find your most patterned masonry examples. And then your half timbered, really, you're going to find more in places such as Newport, where you have a lot of land, because a lot of those are much more sprawling and spread out. You're not going to see those in cities very much. What you do see a lot of in Springfield, though, is you're going to see the spindled Queen Anne, and then you're going to see the free classic Queen Anne. We have so many free classic Queen Annes in the neighborhood. So there were multiple factors. You'll see here that I've kind of divided the time periods where these two sub-styles were more popular. The spindled Queen Anne was more common from the style's origins in 1876 to about 1896. And then the free classic Queen Anne was more common about 1896 to 1910. By 1910 and afterwards, the style kind of fizzled out in popularity and it was completely supplanted by the style that we'll get to in a moment. So there were multiple factors for that. The majority of it is just a change in taste. The colonial revival style was becoming popular at the same time as the Queen Anne style, and we'll discuss that in a moment. So both of these styles were happening at the same time, and eventually colonial revival just completely overtook Queen Anne in popularity. But right now, this window right here is where the time frame where a lot of our Springfield homes were built, where both styles were equally popular. Therefore, they were building Queen Anne homes that have a lot of free classic elements. So free classic elements are where you have your columns supporting the porch, and you have classical details such as modillions, which are these large Georgian-type brackets that are under the eaves of the house, under the roof line. And then your columns here in this example, we have Tuscan columns that are very plain, rounded columns. You'll see columns that are fluted, and then you'll see classical columns that have the orders of Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Sometimes with free classics, you'll see little pairs of columns grouped together on the same house. And then, of course, for the spindled Queen Anne, this is the very early iteration of the style. And the argument can be made that the spindled Queen Anne is really the first truly American style. It did take some, obviously, precedence from England when we have half-timbering influence and the pattern masonry and such. But the unique aspect of our Queen Anne homes in this country is the fact that we use so much wood. This example here, almost the entire house is constructed completely of wood. And of course, we have balloon framing, which is where we have that amazing old growth wood, and the pier runs the entire length of the structure all the way from the basement to the roof, well, in Florida, the foundation to the roof. So that's construction that's really not possible anymore because we don't have that type of wood anymore. But that is what made our Queen Anne homes in America so different from what you would find anywhere else. The use of wood, and then the technologies at this time that emerged allowed us to create homes that weren't so boxy as their predecessors were. During the colonial era, you were really constrained by what you could do with the technologies available. But the development of the balloon frame technology allowed us to have these irregular projections, such as these bay windows, and allowed us to create homes that were more stylistic, and you could have all of these, Victorian era homes are full of these like little nooks and crannies, and have these long hallways and these odd rooms, and all of that was made possible by the balloon frame technology. It was a major advancement at the time. Something else I want to mention. You will not hear me say Victorian style at all tonight. And that is one of my major pet peeves, because Victorian is not a style, it's a time period. And it refers to the reign of Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901. So there's no Victorian style. You can have Victorian era homes, but you don't have Victorian style homes. So just get that out of the way. And then here we have some examples in the neighborhood of the Queen Anne style. So you can see here we have these amazing shingle patterns. This house has 7 different types of shingles on display here. We have this lovely beaded radiating spindle work. You'll see that a lot in the Queen Anne style. Here you can see the influence of the free classic. There's those paired columns I was talking about. And then all of these homes are asymmetrical, meaning that each side does not perfectly match the other side, although I will say, I guess I'm lying here. The Daniels house at the bottom is symmetrical, and that's an unusual example of a symmetrical Queen Anne. Typically with the Queen Anne style, the houses are not symmetrical on either side. So that's an odd example there. But, off-centered bay window, off-centered front door. Here we have this amazing stick work. So anytime you'll see elements that look like, like right here is a perfect example, these turned columns that were done by a lathe, that is indicative of the Eastlake style. So Charles Locke Eastlake was an English furniture designer and I guess you could say influencer of the time. And he published a book in England called Hints on Household Tastes. It was kind of a flop in England. It didn't really resonate with people until it came to America around this time period. It was the same time as the Queen Anne style was gaining popularity, and it just took off. People really took to Eastlake's ideas. Just the problem was Americans misunderstood exactly what Eastlake was saying, and the examples he was decrying as like terrible examples of the Eastlake style. His style was more, he wanted more like the arts and crafts movement, to focus on handmade, that intrinsic value of the artist in every work. And then Americans took his style and applied it to mass-produced furnishings and architecture and called it Eastlake. I mean, what big a slap in the face. So then, he finds out about this overseas, and Eastlake becomes enraged. And he actually made a statement that he's become aware of this style in America that has his name, and he decries it and says, I want it made known, I had nothing to do with this. This is not me, but sadly for Eastlake, it's still branded Eastlake to this day. We have Eastlake furniture, Anytime you see that incisive carving on things, like you'll see spoon carved detail, very finite carvings on furniture. Any antique shop in town, you'll stumble across an Eastlake piece. It was very mass produced, very popular. Sorry, Charles. So, and then another Queen Anne element you'll see towers and turrets. So a tower extends from the bottom floor all the way up to the roof line, and a turret terminates at the second story of the house. Now, have I called this element a turret my entire life and refused to change now? Yes, so I still call them turrets, but technically this is a 3-story tower. And then we have, of course, more of that lovely spindle work. A lot of this was made possible by technologies that evolved at the time, such as steam-powered scroll saws, and then we had large mills popping up across the country. So it became less laborious to cut all of this delicate woodwork, and we were able to do it at lightning speeds. And then we had pattern book catalogs came along, so any carpenter could easily replicate any of this woodwork. Well, I have some examples right in front of me. So I've sourced all of this locally, but this right here, later in my presentation, I will show you an exact example. This, I believe, could very well come from this neighborhood, because there's at least 3 houses I can think of that have this exact gingerbread bracket profile still extant in the neighborhood. This was a very Jacksonville vernacular. Any carpenter could have come up with this in an afternoon or less. Very easy to replicate. So it was that technology that emerged that allowed this mass production of ornament. You know, they say, oh, this beautiful handcrafted. Well, yeah, there were hands involved, but there's a lot of machinery involved too to create all of this delicate woodwork. And of course, this example here, the horseshoe gingerbread arches, that gentleman was a carpenter, advertising his woodworking skills. So we had a lot of tradespeople in the neighborhood at the time. And then of course here we have some close-ups. I just can't get enough of these delicious details, so I'm going to show them to you. So here, this element reminds me a lot, if you've ever been to like seaside towns like Cape May or Ocean Grove, you see a lot of this delicate scroll saw detail in places like that on balustrades. And then this element right here is one of my absolute favorites. So depending on who you ask, this was either called a fan or a sunburst design. So there's 2 homes in Springfield that have this identical pattern. And I think I have the other example in a later slide. But I love that Queen Anne detail. And then right here's a lovely example of an Eastlake front door. Again, you have lots of applied wooden ornament on the bottom. This is a very typical Queen Anne front door. You have the upper, it's a half glass door, so half of the door is glass, and the bottom half has inset panels, and you have that lovely banding of detailing on the drip ledge of the window. And then I just have some more spindle work, turn spindles, lots of different gingerbread, and then we have a beautiful asymmetrical Queen Anne here, very typical of the style. And then let's go inside. So what do we see inside a Queen Anne house? Oh, you're going to see details everywhere. So this was part of the aesthetic movement, meaning you're going to see just beauty for the sake of beauty. Everything was beautiful at this time. So here we have some Eastlake hardware, beautiful, almost Art Nouveau influence with those flowing lines and floral designs. The sunflower is a major Queen Anne motif, and you're going to see that a lot, mostly in the English Queen Annes, but you do see it on some American examples as well. And then, you know, more beaded spindle work. We have a barley twist column here, right here. Lots of fine stained wood. Most of the woods were stained, unless you were in a kitchen or in a servant's quarters, then the wood would have been paint grade. But other than that, the majority of the house would have had stained woodwork. These windows here. So this is very interesting. So in early American architecture, a lot of the windows had separated square muttons that were shaped like these small squares here on the entire window. You would have like either 9/9, 6/6, and that was because at the time they didn't have the technology to make large single sheets of glass like we did at this time period. So it was done out of necessity. But then we get to the Queen Anne era, and then when we talk about the shingle style, it's like, oh, this is a really cool detail. We're going to do this. So then they start doing this detail. When we have the technology to do very large sheets of glass, they continue to do small panes of glass just because it adds more detail and decoration. So it's very interesting. Now, when you see it on Queen Anne homes, you'll see borders like this, and it's called flash glass. When you have stained glass of varying colors around the edge of the window. You'll see that more out on the West Coast for some reason, but I do love that detail. And there's a few homes in Springfield that do have flash glass detailing. And then, of course, the light fixtures. We have a beautiful brass Eastlake light fixture, which unfortunately you can't see the details up close here, but I assure you, it has beautiful stamped brass detailing up close around this area here, with a porcelain center right here. And we know that this was originally a gasolier. And how do we know that? Because the shades are pointing upwards. Gas fixtures, the shades pointed upwards. Electric fixtures, they pointed downwards if they were electric. Sometimes you'll see gasoliers that are a combination of the two, because it was that strange period where we're like, you know, I'm not sure about this electricity thing. It seems like a fad, so I'm going to get. So I have both options, kind of like the Betamax and the VCR at the time. And then, of course, you know, even like in a fireplace summer screen divider, it's just detail everywhere, beautiful detail everywhere. Okay, so folk Victorian style. So I'm going to preface this by saying that I decided, because it can get too complicated if you vary your sources, I was going to go pull most of my information from McAllister's, so I used their book as my guide for building this presentation. There are some architectural historians that would argue that folk Victorian does not exist. It's a made-up thing, and McAllister kind of did coin this term. And some people will argue that a folk Victorian is simply just a variation of the Queen Anne. It's just a much simpler vernacular form of the Queen Anne style. And that is essentially what folk Victorian is. So it's taking a house that is a very plain frame dwelling that without a porch and all of the gingerbread detailing that's applied to it would be a vernacular house. It really wouldn't have much else in terms of detail if you didn't have the gingerbread on the porch. So that is what puts it over the edge and makes it more folk Victorian. And folk Victorian is really something you only see in the South. It's not as prevalent the further north you go. We have a lot of folk Victorians down here. We have a lot in Jacksonville. And it's often called the poor man's Victorian. Because, you know, as I just said, all of this woodwork was mass produced. You could buy it from a catalog or a pattern book, have a carpenter replicate it. If you were handy, you could probably do it yourself. So you could take a simple home and really dress it up with a lot of details. And this is also why you'll see this a lot, mostly up north when you see farm homesteads and everything with very early American buildings. Like I saw this a lot in Pennsylvania, but you have like the stone buildings and the brick buildings, where it's this very clearly, you know, it's an 18th century farmhouse building, but then you have this tacked on, very elaborate late Victorian era porch that's just covered in gingerbread. And so that became a way of sort of modernizing your home a little bit, very cost effective. You don't have to remodel the whole house. Just tack on this beautiful elaborate front porch, and whammo, you're up to date. You've got all the latest fashion, you've got your gingerbread, you can sit on your new porch. So it was a very cost effective, and so you saw that a lot on farms. You'll see a lot of folk Victorians in that locale. And then here's a close-up, and as I promised, so right here, it may not be exact, but it's pretty darn close. Pretty darn close. And then right here is the other example of that fan or sunburst motif up close. I just love that detail. It's one of my absolute favorites. All right, and then here's some more illustrations. So obviously we don't have any early American homes in Springfield, but I feel that this is important to touch on to provide us our foundation, so to speak, of how we got to where we got to in Springfield in terms of architecture. And you can't talk about American architecture without discussing colonial era architecture. So the architectural styles that you saw primarily during the colonial era were Federal and Georgian. Those were the two primary ones. Georgian named after King George. And then Federal is also sometimes called the Adam style, and was named after a gentleman who was named Adam in England, who pioneered that style, but when it came over to America, it became called the Federal style. So the two styles, if you squint, are really very similar until you start picking apart the details. I like to give this example. So Georgian Revival often falls under the Colonial Revival umbrella, but if you're going to picture what a Georgian Revival house would look like, I'm sure you've all seen Home Alone. That massive brick Georgian with the large modillions under the eaves, the shutters, the central portico with the Tuscan columns. that is Georgian. You can't get any more Georgian than a house like that. So that's a great example of that style. The federal style was more delicate. The modillions were much smaller in the cornice area, and at that time they developed a compound called compo, which allowed them to sculpt all of those fine architectural details that we began to see in homes, such as the urns and on fireplace mantles. You would often have those ribbon swags that appeared. You would see that a lot in the federal Adam style. That became possible by technologies that emerged during that time period. So those are elements that we're going to see pop up again in the colonial revival era in Springfield. I wanted to show this image because this is a very good representation of a common working class colonial era home, and it all centers around practicality and the idea of the hearth and home. You're gathered with your family, this is your primary space, and everyone's in the same room all the time. I'm sure they got really sick of one another. And then you have your ingle nook area right here with your big bench that you would all gather around the fire. So this idea of hearth and home, that's going to come up again too. So keep that in mind. So the colonial revival style. We also have some excellent examples of the colonial revival style. And looking at these, there is going to be some overlap from Queen Anne because, as I said, these were happening at the same time. So sometimes elements were being borrowed from both styles and incorporated on both styles. I think a few of the best examples we have in the neighborhood is the Arnett Mansion, which was designed by architect Leon Beaver from Knoxville. This is an incredibly pure example of the colonial revival style. And you can see that we have a lot of Georgian influence with these massive modillions that are under the eaves. We have our broken pediments, and then we have our spindle work. So the term spindle is a very important element on colonial revival style. It imitates Venetian balustrades. So that was the whole idea when you see these very massive, large term spindle balustrades on the front porches. And then again, you're going to see all classical orders. So your columns are going to be Tuscan, they'll be fluted, they'll be Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, composite. You'll see any one of those combinations on these front porches. And then you will see decorative bracketing. These houses, though, are mostly symmetrical. So, well, this one has a lot of Queen Anne influence, but for the most part, they're very symmetrical. I always like to say if you fold the house in half like a piece of paper, it's going to be a mirror image on each side. And then, of course, here, once again, we have the broken pediment, a very strong federal detail there. And also we have the Palladian window, so that arched window, very colonial revival in nature. And then going inside, so here once again, so that this element right here is incredibly federal. We have the laurel wreath with the bow and ribbon motif, incredibly colonial revival. We have this beautiful Palladian window. Again, we have a bow and ribbon swag, leaded glass. You'll see on a lot of our Springfield colonial revival homes. Bas relief imitating a shield. Some of those beautiful, massive turned spindles that are imitating a Venetian balustrade. And then we have our Palladian window right here. And then going inside, so I particularly am fond of this illustration right here. I feel that it very nicely captures colonial revival architecture. What I want you to notice is the majority of the woodwork is painted. So for colonial revival homes, the woodwork is painted usually white. So it may not have always been stained. This staircase right here, this is an excellent example of a colonial revival staircase, and also a shingle style staircase. It could be in either style house. And the reason I say that is because I want to draw your attention to this detail right here. It's kind of like a U shape on the landing. I wish I'd taken a better picture of it, but that detail right there is so indicative of the shingle style. So indicative of that style. You have that bent U shape. And then the colonial revival style also had a lot of glass doorknobs because that was becoming popular at the time. So that's the type of hardware that you would see in colonial revival homes. And then what I wanted you to put a pin in to remember that ingle-nook concept of the hearth and home. There it is again. We have this idea of an ingle-nook with a fireplace, some comfy chairs where the family can gather. So the Colonial Revival really is where the Queen Anne style was all about innovation during the Exposition. The Colonial Revival, which by the way also debuted at the Exposition, which we'll get to in a moment, it was about returning to America's roots and embracing who we were as a people and embracing our heritage. Because 100 years had passed at that point, and we began to feel nostalgic about our shared past. So they both became popular at the same time, but eventually Colonial Revival would overtake Queen Anne in popularity, and it would remain popular well into the 1950s. And then this element right here is from a house in Springfield, and this was a gift given to me by a dear friend, but this is the original piece right here. So this is from a house at the corner of 7th and Liberty, an amazing Colonial Revival house. And so here we have this amazing callback to a federal element of having like a Rococo type, this detail right here, like a conch shell, or it could also be a fan design, but so indicative of the Colonial Revival era. And I'm very honored to have that piece. This is the replicated piece because this is half of the size of this replication here. So Carpenter was actually able to replicate that, but this is the original that was there when the house was restored. Okay, so this house is not in Springfield. Not in Springfield. So, and I may have taken this from Street View too. I didn't have time to go over and take the actual picture, so my apologies. This house is on Montgomery Place in Avondale. And the reason I wanted to show this house is because apple pie baseball, this is your quintessential all-American house. I'm a big fan of the show Mad Men. This very much reminds me of the house that Dawn and Betty Draper live in. This is that mid-century ideal of what home is, where you're going to live in the suburbs, where you're going to raise a family, and it all is incredibly Colonial Revival because we have that really strong tie to our recent past. But this home was not built during the colonial era. It was built in the 1920s. So that is about the time that, and I want to show this image because I want to show you how different the same style can be in the same city. So our Colonial Revivals in Springfield are all heavily Queen Anne influenced, or are very high style, early iterations of the Colonial Revival style. Think of like the Barnett Mansion. And then this is what it became eventually, which is actually a more faithful representation because the early iterations are very romanticized. It's this like view of what the past could be. Everything is so refined. We have all of these additional applied details because they didn't have that technology then to mass produce all of these details that are on the houses that we have in Springfield. So it really was romanticized in the early years, and then by this time period, this is actually a much more faithful representation of an early colonial house in America. And then, of all the styles I'm going to talk about tonight, this should be the easiest style to identify in Springfield, and it all hinges on one element, and it is like a barn roof, but it is called a gambrel roof. And it has two very steep pitches that join together at the peak to form this barn-like structure. It was inspired by the Netherlands, and really the Dutch colonial style does fall under the Colonial Revival umbrella. But here I've separated it just because we have a very high concentration of them in Springfield. We have 18 Dutch colonial homes that I've cataloged. I've made an Excel spreadsheet to document all of them. 6 of those 18 were designed by Brown Realty Company. And then, so 3 of those 18 were designed by Brown Realty Company. 6 of them were built in 1906. I don't know what it was about the year 1906, but they're like, ooh, I love me a Dutch colonial. So we have a lot of them are on walnut for some reason. It's really interesting. So I don't know, I haven't figured out yet what the correlation is between all that information. And then our last Dutch colonial that was built in the neighborhood was built in 1960. And then, really what you have with Dutch colonial, it's quite simple. It's a Colonial Revival style home with the gambrel roof tacked on top. That's really, it doesn't get much more in depth than that. It's a very easy to identify style of architecture. But what I love about the homes in Springfield is all of the different types of windows that you see. And they really are the eyes of the building. They're such important character defining features. So here, once again, like I said, we have this allusion to the past where they didn't have the technology to do the large sheets of glass like we do on the bottom sash here, but It was just at that time seen as a neat element, so they used it. It created more interest. And then of course we have all of our, this is called tulip pattern window, and you'll have versions that are full diamond and very indicative of the time period. Really, you'll see these style windows on the most prevalent styles in Springfield. You'll see them on Queen Anne, you'll see them on Craftsman homes, and you'll see them on Colonial Revival. So really, those window styles predominate throughout the neighborhood, regardless of home style. And I think a lot of that has to do with, as I said, lots of building industry in the neighborhood, lots of pattern book circulation at the time. So a lot of these elements were used interchangeably because it's just what was popular and it's what people wanted. Okay, neoclassical revival. This is also an interesting one. We also have a lot of these homes in Springfield. And these are the homes that I would identify as like a pseudo-Greek temple. They are very grandiose and they have a very large scale. And it's because of these multi-story columns. And really a high style example of the neoclassical revival that's a little bit different than what we're going to see in Springfield is actually like the White House. So when you think of neoclassical, it really classical. Like we are drawing from Greek and Roman elements and putting them on homes. So here, once again, we have this cornice of very large modillions. Sometimes you'll see dental molding, which are very small, look like rows of teeth that line the cornice, and actually you can't really see it here, but it is there. Here we have the Ionic column order, which has the volutes, which were made to replicate the look of a ram's horn. And then right here we have our composite order columns. So really, that is what the main focus is for the neoclassical revival style. And then of course, once again, we have our broken pediment that we saw back when we talked about the federal style coming into play. We have a lot of these homes in Springfield, and they're very interesting homes, especially the one on the right, because it is quite grandiose for being such a narrow row house. It's very interesting. And that brings us to an intermission, just real quick. If you haven't checked it out, please be sure to check out our mini-series for Architectural Adventures, which is on our YouTube channel, Historic Springfield Society Jacks. We have the QR code up here at the end if you want to scan it. But we are going to be beginning our third season very soon. So stay tuned. We're going to start filming within the next few weeks. Life always gets in the way, and we have intentions of starting sooner. But we are coming back, and we already have a full season planned out, which is going to be very exciting. We have a lot of different things planned from what we've done previously. So we hope that you'll tune in. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, back to it. So the Craftsman style. This is another style that we have a lot of in Springfield. And the Craftsman style is an interesting one because it was really attributed to another gentleman that was kind of the influencer of the time named Gustav Stickley. Now Stickley was not an architect. He never designed a building. He remodeled a house that was the Queen Anne style at the turn of the century. And then in 1903 in New Jersey, he built a Craftsman house, but he didn't build it himself. So he wasn't really an architect or builder, but he was a furniture maker. He was a furniture designer. He apprenticed under his uncle, so that's how he got his knowledge of furniture and his love of furniture. And in 1901, he was so taken by the works of William Morris, who you may know, he's mostly known for his textile designs. William Morris did these incredible, they're public domain, so you see his designs everywhere these days. But you'll see like playing cards and random things that are all William Morris patterns, but he designed amazing wallpapers and textiles. And so what a lot of people don't realize though is William Morris was heavily involved in the arts and crafts movement in England. It was this movement of artisans who got together and formed this collective, and they were really all about return to nature and the arts and crafts. It was definitely a social movement. It was all about, very much like John Ruskin's teachings of, that intrinsic value in the item. You can tell when a craftsman worked on something, that embodied energy of whether or not they enjoyed working on it. It can get a little woo-woo if you get into it. But that goes into the whole, architectural interior standards of feeling, right? That feeling of craftsmanship, that kind of thing. So it's very much along that line of thinking. But he was so taken by William Morris's teachings in England that he gave William Morris a platform. And in 1901, Stickley self-published a book called The Craftsman. It was a magazine publication. You could subscribe for $2 a year, and you would get issues of it. And actually, if you want to read it, it's available through the library. We have like 40 issues of The Craftsman digitized, so you can look at it from your home. Just search the catalog of The Craftsman; it will come up. Some of it is a little hard to get through because it does have a focus on architecture in points, but a lot of it is about socialism and other social movements, because that was what William Morris was all about, really, and that is the heart of the Craftsman movement. And I also want to bring up the fact that if you don't think of all these architectural styles and movements as reactions against things or as political or anything, then you probably should, because a lot of this, as I mentioned before, a lot of it is about branding and selling a product, selling an idea, and that is very much what the Craftsman style was about. So the Craftsman ran from 1901 to 1915, and it was actually ghostwritten. Stickley didn't even write it; he published it. He had a female writer who lived in, I think she lived in Syracuse, named Irene Sargent. And she was the ghostwriter for the Craftsman. So every article that you'll read in that was written by a woman who went uncredited for many years. So give her credit tonight. So the Craftsman style. I look at Craftsman homes and I don't look at them as simplistic, but that's me looking at it through my modern lens. It is, at the time, it was startlingly simple compared to coming out of the Queen Anne era of architecture, where just things upon things loaded onto the building. So Craftsman was really a return to simplicity, a return to craftsmanship, hand building, and it was really important to honor the person who erected the structure and the building elements. Now, the real irony of the Craftsman style is, it's a movement that started out with good intentions. It started out with, embodied energy, a return to handmade elements, a return to craftsmanship. And then when it became a style overseas here in the US, of course, we Americans did what we always do. Developers snapped it up and said, this is popular. And they started marketing Craftsman-style bungalows. The name Craftsman became used on everything. You would see bungalow used on everything. I mean, the term bungalow, looking at research, was used extensively in Jacksonville very early on. I've looked at newspapers, 2-room bungalow for rent, charming bungalow. A bungalow became a buzzword that was highly marketed and highly used, and it was very desirable. Bungalow actually is originating from India. So it originated from the term Bengali, which was a small frame house with a small porch. So there you go. But oftentimes with the Craftsman style, you'll hear the two used synonymously, so you'll hear smushed together Craftsman bungalow, as if it's like one word. So it's become synonymous with the Craftsman style, but originally it was kind of its own thing. I personally stick to the current idiom of Craftsman bungalow, and if it's like a small Queen Anne single-story house, I call it a cottage. But that's just my personal crazy preference. So all of these elements, though they allude to being handmade craftsmanship, I mean, it's the same methods of woodworking that were used to create Queen Anne elements. However, with the Craftsman style, they did pride themselves on using rugged natural materials. So you would see materials that were indicative of nature, suggestive of nature. So we have lots of, not so much in Jacksonville, but we would have stone foundations. We have a lot of brick here in Springfield foundations. And a material that is like a Springfield vernacular that you see a lot in our homes are these cast concrete rusticated blocks. Those were used a lot around the turn of the century. It became very popular. In fact, you'll see several homes in the neighborhood that are constructed entirely of cast concrete. It was very popular. You could order it from Sears Catalog. So it was definitely not like quarried stone, but it was the suggestion of it which counts for something. But the idea of the craftsman style was really, sometimes you'll see them where I think, do I show here? Yes. So this element right here, this tapered, undulating surface here, gives the illusion that the structure is kind of like rising from the ground. So that was really important for the craftsman style, as if the building had just, and this is even more so important when we get into the prairie style, but it's like, it's risen from the earth, it's so tied to nature and its environs. And then of course, we have some influence from Japan right here. So we have a lot of influence from pagodas and things such as that. That, again, highly influenced the craftsman style elements. And again, we'll also see that with the prairie style. It highly influenced that. Another craftsman element that's very important is the tapered post here. So you have a post that's much more narrow near the top, and then it becomes much wider as you move down. That is incredibly indicative of the craftsman style. And then, of course, we have our knee brace bracket, also very indicative of the craftsman style. An important difference between the craftsman and the Queen Anne style is, as I like to say, craftsman homes like to let it all hang out. It's all about the structure and the building, the technical aspects of the building. It was more functional than it was to be decorative. And you're going to see these exposed rafter tails, which are the actual beams of the house right here on the end. And that's something you don't really see on a Queen Anne style house. You just don't. They really wanted to showcase the architecture and the building that went into the construction of the home. That was important. And then going inside craftsman homes, it's very important to have all of that wood. Craftsman homes are notorious for their built-ins, for richly stained woods, a variety of different woods, and again, your craftsmanship. There was a lot of thought and detailing that went into it, and it was to give the illusion of everything being hand-built, everything being handmade, even if it wasn't. It was a suggestion of that. Craftsman homes are unpretentious, they're very homey. It's a home that you wander into, and you'll feel like you can just sit down by a cozy fire and read a book. It's not anything that's pretentious, it's a home that feels lived in, rustic. And lots of earth tones, very craftsman in nature. And hardware, this is the time where we have the development of the shepherd's hook handle, and you'll see that on a lot of craftsman front doors. And then we have, again, we have that Far East influence. This is an incredibly common craftsman element, the electrified lantern, craftsman lantern. You'll see that everywhere. We have several in Springfield. And then again, we have a new electric light with slide glass, also very arts and crafts in nature, and caustic tile, very craftsman. So again, it's a very homey style. And then we have art glass. Some in Queen Anne homes we have stained glass. In craftsman and prairie homes, it's art glass. It's a very important distinction. And then right here, I should have included a picture, so I don't think you'll be able to see it very well. But this is inspired by a Stickley chair, which is he was a furniture maker, and that's one thing that he really sold that still bears his name. With Stickley furniture, you know it because of the very tight, tight-spaced, not spindles, but the pickets on the slats. You'll know that because of the slats, and it's also repeated on craftsman staircases. They were very tight, spaced together, and they were often called mission-style pieces of furniture. Again, not really tied to California missions. This was all marketing. Oh, that's so nice, how charming. It's from the California missions. It's like the furniture they have there, right? Right? But that's, so even today, mission style. Okay, shingle style. Shingle style has a very interesting history. And the thing about, and then by the way, we only have like a handful of shingle style homes in Springfield. We have like maybe 3 or 4. One of them is a very good example. So you're probably like, why am I wasting my time on this? It's a really good story, that's why. So the shingle style is another one that people argue, either they'll say that the Queen Anne style or the shingle style is the most original American style. It's the style that's the first one that's uniquely ours. It's not tied to the British monarchy. It's not, Georgian, which King George, none of that. It is very ours. So this engraving right here, and this photograph, really the photograph on the left, was kind of the birth of the shingle style, believe it or not. And it all originated by McKim, Mead, and White. And forgive me, I don't recall which one of the three took this photograph. If I had to guess, I think it's White, based on my memory. But they traveled the New England coastline. And at the time, it had been 100 years since these homes were erected. And these early American homes were to the point now where some folks were looking at them and being like, realizing even then, even in the late 1800s, that this is part of our heritage. These need to be preserved. They're not in good condition. This is a style that was not popular at that time at all. They had fallen out of fashion, and a lot of them were falling into disrepair. And people who had the foresight, like McKim, Mead, and White, were looking at these early American structures that were in a ruin, and were like, we need to do something. So one of the things that they did, because obviously they had the means, they did photograph a lot of these early American homes. And this is one of them. By the way, this is the back of the house. That's what's so funny. This is the back of a very grand two-story. You wouldn't be able to tell it's a two-story, but this roof slopes very steep. It's not a salt box technically, but it's almost steep enough to be considered a salt box. But the front of it is your typical, federal style house, very symmetrical, very large, long, like your typical colonial home is. I should have included a picture of the front. But they took a picture of the back of it. And this image here, for whatever reason, it really grabbed people's attention. People looked at this and it resonated with them. It was something about the ramshackle nature of it, the rugged characteristics, and the fact that the back of it was completely covered in these like old worn shingles. There was just something about this that gave a feeling of nostalgia and an idea of what America was. And it just really resonated with people. This was home. This was very comforting and a very relaxed type of environment. And then it was reproduced, so you can see right here that Stanford White actually did a sketch of it, and it was published in a book that was widely circulated. And this is not the same building, but it's very similar. It's that same idea. He tried to replicate the same feeling here. So here they are. Here's the three gentlemen: Charles McKim, William Rutherford Mead, and Stanford White. And so Franklin Wright can be argued to be the most influential American architect. These three gentlemen here, I would argue, are the most influential firm in American history. They are responsible for influencing so much of America's architectural history. They were involved in not the Centennial Exposition, but in Chicago. Columbia, thank you. Columbian Exposition in 1893. Involved in style, and it was part of the City Beautiful movement. Bonus points. Lightning round. They were part of that City Beautiful movement where everything should be beautiful, and it was a return to classicism. And so this is one of their earliest structures. And I don't know if anyone else is like me. I know at least one person in this room is. If you're a fan of the HBO series The Gilded Age, then you have been to this structure if we don't even realize it. So this is the Newport Casino. And this is the first shingle-style building in America. And it was designed by these guys right here. And so this building, first of all, casino, there was never any gambling that took place here. Casino was an Italian term from casina, which meant a beautiful field. So really it alludes to the fact that it's a very large field in the center where people can congregate. So there was never any gambling that took place here. It was always a social club. There was lots of tennis. You can see that present day it's the International Hall of Fame for tennis. And if you go to their website, everyone should do this. I'm telling you to do this. You can they have digitally mapped out the entire building, so you can do a virtual tour without even going there. It is so cool. You feel like you're standing right on the green, and you can go up and look through the gingerbread and be like, oh, I'm here. You feel like you're there. It's very cool. So I definitely recommend doing it. So the International Tennis Hall, the Newport Casino was really the beginning of the shingle style, and they took inspiration from what they had collected on their trips to New England. the images I just showed you. And so you'll see that the distinction is the entire structure. Now here we do have some sandstone at the bottom, but the majority of the structure is covered with shingles, typically of cedar, that were not painted and they were allowed to weather, and that gave them, over time, that weathered, ramshackle look. And you'll see shingle style a lot in coastal areas, especially Newport, places where they have a lot of vacation homes, because it was seen as like a more relaxed, more informal, although it does have a lot of formal elements. And this building here is a very playful design. I really love how it's kind of like a big shingle hug, because if you're in the center of it, it's kind of like Bernini's arms. It stretches around you, and you can really get a good vantage point no matter where you're positioned in the stands. It's got this two-tiered piazza that stretches around the entire perimeter of the center. A detail that I love, that it just gives you an idea of why this was essential in 1880. So this clock tower here, this clock was large in the center so that everyone, including the players on the field playing tennis, had a clear view because they didn't have their pocket watches with them. So they could just glance up, oh, I know what time it is. So that's just, it's very indicative of the time period. And of course we have the bell-shaped roof here, very indicative of the shingle style. And this color here, I meant to mention this earlier with one of the other houses we looked at. This color is so indicative of the shingle style and of the Queen Anne style. You would see this green a lot historically. And it goes by different names. Sometimes it's known as Kelly green. This is like a very good example of a Kelly green right here, this lightish green. And then sometimes it's known as forest green. But that's a very period appropriate color for the trim. And typically, every trim piece was painted that color. It was either white or it was that color. So you would have the trim that green, you'd have the window sashes that green, and it's quite lovely if you have like a brick house and you have the contrast of the green. So it's a really nice play on one another. But in the 90s it came back with a vengeance and it was called forest green, if you were there, you remember. It was everywhere, on the walls, I mean. But that green color is very indicative of Queen Anne and shingle style. So here are some examples we have in the neighborhood of the shingle style. So an important difference, so it does take a Queen Anne house form. So these houses are very asymmetrical. Each side is different. And something that's important though with the shingle style is we have, if you have like an element, like we don't have any here, but if you have like a tower, it's not going to be a freestanding like conical roof or anything. It's going to be attached and like as if it's growing out of the structure. So it will be affixed to the structure and it won't be like a freestanding element that's on its own. So you won't have that soaring conical roof like some of the turrets or towers we have in Springfield. It will be like it's growing out of the roof line, if that makes sense. But we have the bay window. I mean, this house here on the left, that's the best example of the shingle style that we have in the neighborhood. Now this here was a remodel that was done in the 1930s. And this is very typical of 1930s Tudor or storybook style architecture. We have the timber frame door, it has iron strapping, and then this suspended portico here, all from that renovation. But actually, it also works very well with the shingle style. And then right here, I want to draw your attention to this curve right here. That is so shingle style. And I did a call out here, you can't see it very well, but right here, this is this area here. Ooh, that's so shingle style. Having that rounded bay window there, very, very shingle style. Okay, prayer. So, I will talk about Clitho, but we can't talk about that gentleman until we talk about a gentleman by the name of Frank Lloyd Wright. Everyone in this room, I am sure, has heard that name before. So, Frank Lloyd Wright was not, he didn't go to school for architecture. He was always interested in architecture. He never attended school for it. He learned the old-fashioned way, which is the way a lot of architects learned at that time. He was an apprentice. So he apprenticed under another gentleman whose name I hope you've heard of, by the name of Louis Sullivan, who is big in Chicago. He is known as the father of the modern skyscraper. And then Frank Lloyd Wright is known as the father of modernism. So Wright interned for Sullivan and learned a lot from him. What he took from Sullivan was, and they got along really well, they worked really well together, and he greatly admired Sullivan as a mentor. But what he took from Sullivan was the idea that the form was very important. You'll notice with Wright's work, it's a lot about geometry. You can see the shape of the structure. you can see the geometry of it. You see every square, every box, every angled line, every trapezoid-like geometry. He uses it a lot in his art class elements. That was very important to Wright, and he got that from working under Sullivan. Another thing that I'll point out later, which Clutho actually also got from Wright, is the ornamentation that is influenced by Sullivan, which we'll look at in a moment. So highly influenced by him. This is a story that it's a little bit of a tangent, but please allow it because it's a really good story. So in Chicago, where Wright lived, it's a suburb called Oak Park. And there's a lot of, obviously, prairie style homes because that was ground zero for the prairie since Wright was there. His home was there. His home was actually initially the shingle style, which was interesting. A lot of people don't realize this. Wright's early works were based on what Sullivan was doing at the time, which at the time, what was in the highly popular was the Queen Anne style. So that's the style Wright was primarily working in his early years. And much like when Clutho came to Jacksonville, the styles that were popular were neoclassical revival. So that's what Clutho's early work was. So you have to go where you're being paid and do what you're being paid to do. So before the prairie style took off, a lot of Wright's buildings were Queen Anne style. But you can still tell it's a very Wrightian building because the geometry is incredibly present on his early homes. So he was a newly married man, he had children, and he needed to make ends meet. He wasn't content with his apprenticeship, so he decided to strike out on his own and take some side work under the table, which was a breach of his contract as an intern with Sullivan. He got away with it for a little bit until Sullivan found out. They had a really good relationship until that point. At that point, so there's 3 houses, coincidentally on Chicago Avenue, a stone's throw from Wright's own home. So he knew the gentleman he built these for. And they're called the Bootleg Houses. It's 3 beautiful Queen Anne homes built for a man named Gale, and one of them was his own home, and then the other 2 were going to be income properties that he was going to sell. So once Sullivan found out about that, he cut ties with Wright, and that was the point where Wright put out his proverbial shingle and went to work starting his own firm. So really, it was those houses that led Wright to go out on his own and gave birth to what would become the prairie style, because it wasn't until he started his own firm that he was able to start doing what he wanted to do and what excited him about architecture, and started playing around with it and found his people who were interested in his ideas and his new ways of thinking. Because up to this point, this was just not done. His ideas were so revolutionary and so different. It was just unlike anything anyone had ever seen before up to that point. And certainly wasn't like the other residential homes that were being built around him at that time. So he added on an addition to his house, and he opened up his firm, and that's really where the prairie style began. So our man here, Clutho, who we're all very well acquainted with. Once again, I told you to remember the fire. So that fire, really you can credit the fire for ushering Jacksonville into a new era of buildings, because it was the impetus that led to Clutho opening up his morning paper on May 4th in New York, where he was with his office, and seeing massive amounts of potential to come to Jacksonville and start over and build the city in his image with his new ideas. Really, to Clutho, the Great Fire was nothing but opportunity. And so he came here, and as I just mentioned, a lot of people don't realize this. When Clutho started, if you look at his early works, you would look at that and be like, Clutho did that? Because he won the commission for City Hall back then, which is unfortunately no longer standing, but it had this amazing dome, very, very neoclassical, almost Beaux-Arts inspired. Not at all what you would think of when you think of a Clutho structure. Also, it's on Julia Street, the Porter Mansion, which is this beautiful, massive neoclassical revival structure. It has these, those monumental columns, and it has that suspended balcony on the 2nd story that's cantilevered. It has, the turns, spindles, and everything. It's very neoclassical. Not at all what you think of when you think of Clutho. So Clutho took a trip to Chicago in 1905, and as the fates would have it, he crossed paths with Frank Lloyd Wright through some means, and Clutho fell in love with Wright's teachings and ideas and was very taken with them. So much so that when he came back to Jacksonville, he started working in the prairie style and he erected his own home in 1909, which was originally on Main Street, and it was inspired by one of Wright's works, which is the Ward Willets House, located in Highland Park, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. So if you look at the two side by side, especially in the window area here and the terrace area, you're like, oh yeah, that is definitely inspired by the Ward Willets House. And then another thing, so Clutho pulled several writing elements. He uses the tree of life here on the side, which is a very common prairie element. And then, do I have this next slide? Yes, okay. So he uses, I should have done a close up, but the prairie cross. So the symbol for our neighborhood, our historic Springfield, is the prairie cross. And so that element that Clutho used was taken from the Larkin building that Wright designed, which was located in Buffalo, New York. Sadly, that building was demolished, but it had these two incredible, and the building on Main Street has incredible large examples as well that are very close to what the examples on the Larkin building look like. But this right here was again the idea that this is something that's this is not Greco-Roman, this is not classically inspired, it doesn't have the acanthus leaves and all the fussy ornamentation. This is a modern column capital that has no, it's almost like international in a sense. It has no ties to a specific time or place. This is new, this is modern, this is ours. And so that was really the idea behind the Prairie Cross. It's a column capital that has no historical precedent. It's very different. And then something that Clutho also took from Wright, that this is a common element of the prairie style, but Wright was really a big fan of obscuring his front entrances. It's almost like the house is kind of a fortress that is permitting entry, but you have to really look for it. It's not like the Queen Anne homes where the front porch and the steps in the front door are the focal point. That's where your eyes draw immediately. Look at this porch, right here, enter here, but the prairie style, it's kind of tucked off to the side. And then you'll notice this is like a stoop. It's not a large porch where you're gonna sit out there and relax. Instead, with the prairie style, we have the terrace. So Wright loved him a good terrace. So they were, it was very common in Illinois because the climate suited to that well. Wright would make sure that there were a lot of trees planted on the ground so that, you know, in this summer you would have the shade from the trees and you could sit out there and you would be obscured from public view. And then in the winter when the trees had no leaves, you would get that sun and it would warm you. And then you had these large windows that again invited sunlight. These large overhanging eaves without any ornamentation served a very practical purpose of providing shade in an era where there was no air conditioning yet. And so you could also have air circulation, you could lift your windows and you could have your windows open during the rain and capture that breeze. You wouldn't get water inside. All very Wrightian concepts that Clutho employed. So he was very heavily influenced by Wright in his work. And then once again, here's some close-ups of those elements. Again, another example of a prairie-type cross, a much more simplistic version that you'll see in Springfield, but very indicative of the style. Tree of life window right here. And then if you remember, I asked you to remember Sullivan's ornamentation. So Sullivan liked to take very simple geometric forms, and then he would incorporate a lot of detail that was almost verging on Art Nouveau. You have all of those flowing lines that resemble vines and everything, incorporated with geometry. So this right here in the Clutho house on the mantle is very Sullivan-esque in nature. And then of course, even some of our miltposts in the neighborhood, you'll see lots of houses in the neighborhood, regardless of whether they're prairie or craftsman style, that have this prairie cross element. And then Tudor style, right here, these are the only two Tudor style homes that we have in Springfield. This is a style that became popular much later, so that's why you don't see it as much in Springfield. We were pretty much built out by the time the Tudor style came to vogue. And there's really no one person that is credited with what is called the Tudor revival, even though in America we had no original Tudors, so we're not reviving anything. We're reviving what they did in England, essentially. So some people do call it Tudor revival, but there's no revival. It's new to us. So this house on the left, on Liberty, that is the best example of the Tudor style that we have in the neighborhood. I mean, this is textbook example Tudor. We have the lozenge windows, we have an oriel bay window, so that is when the bay window is jutting out suspended or cantilevered over the frame of the house. We have all this half timbering, we have segmental arches, even a Tudor style light fixture. I mean, this house, that's Tudor. And then, you know, the Merrill Stevens house, this is also an excellent example of Tudor architecture. We have some very lovely decorative Tudor style bracketing here that's done with the stick work. This is an example of Tudor where you have a brick first story and then a stucco second story. But these are the two best examples we have in the neighborhood of the Tudor style. And you see a lot more Tudor homes in Avondale and San Marco than you do here in Springfield. And then, as I mentioned, I have this handout available up here if you would like a copy that features some of the books that are my favorites on the subject. So if you'd like to pick up a copy, and then I tried to select books that we have at the library. Some of them we do. I'm sorry, some of them we just don't. But if you're so inclined, these are the books